Imagine a man is sentenced to death. His crime? Telling a bad joke. This wasn't an open mic night. This was the royal court of France. And the man in the silly hat just told the king a truth he didn't want to hear. The axe is coming. This was a very real danger for the medieval court jester. So when you picture a jester, you probably see a colorful juggling fool, bells jingling, doing cartwheels for a laugh. But what if I told you that this was one of the most dangerous and, surprisingly, one of the most powerful positions in the entire kingdom? Forget the acrobatics and the silly songs for a moment. We need to ask a different question. Why would a king, a person with absolute power over life and death, not only tolerate but pay someone to openly mock them? The answer is far more complex and brilliant than you might think. And by the time we're done, you will understand why a king would listen to his fool more than his own generals, and why that fool had to sleep with one eye open every single night. You see, the common image we have of a court jester is, frankly, a cartoon, a caricature that has been passed down through sanitized stories and Renaissance fairs. We think of them as simple clowns, there to provide a bit of light relief between jousting tournaments and royal banquets. But that's like saying a modern political satirist is just some guy who's good at impressions. The truth is, that silly-looking jester, the one in the motley costume and the ridiculous hat, was often the only person in the entire country who was allowed to tell the truth. Think about the structure of a medieval court. It's a snake pit of ambition, flattery, and paranoia. Every advisor, every nobleman, every courtier has an agenda. They tell the king what he wants to hear, or they tell him what will benefit them personally. Honesty is a currency so rare it might as well be dragon's gold. Any direct criticism of the king, no matter how valid, would be seen as treason. And the penalty for treason was, well, not pleasant. But the jester? The jester operated under a special kind of diplomatic immunity. He was the licensed truth-teller. His official title was often fool, and because he was a fool, his words weren't supposed to be taken seriously. And that was his superpower. He could wrap a bitter truth in the sweetness of a joke. He could point out a disastrous military strategy with a silly song. He could criticize the queen's lavish spending through a comical puppet show. But in many ways, the jester was the kingdom's first free press. A one-man news commentary and editorial, all rolled into one. And the king, if he was smart, would listen. Because the jester, who had no land to gain and no title to protect, was often the only one giving him the unfiltered truth about the state of his kingdom and the mood of his people. So let's follow a jester through a typical day. Let's call him Thomas. Thomas doesn't just wake up and start juggling. He wakes up and starts listening. His ears are his most valuable asset. As he walks through the castle, he's not just an entertainer. He's an intelligence officer. He hears the gossip from the kitchen staff, the complaints from the guards, the whispered plots of ambitious lords in the hallways. He absorbs it all. He knows which lord is secretly in debt, which visiting dignitary is a drunk, and which of the king's advisors is secretly undermining him. Later, the great hall is filled for the evening feast. The air is thick with tension. The king has been in a black mood all day after a border dispute with a neighboring kingdom went badly. The nobles are silent, nervously picking at their food, terrified of saying the wrong thing. A single misplaced word could mean being banished from court, or worse. The musicians play softly, trying not to draw attention. The silence is deafening. Then, Thomas, the jester, steps into the middle of the room. The bells on his hat jingle softly. He doesn't tell a loud, boisterous joke. That would be suicide. Instead, he looks at the king's plate, piled high with roasted swan, and says with a sigh, "Your Majesty, I see your swan is as overstuffed and uncomfortable as our kingdom's treasury." A collective gasp goes through the room. It's a direct, biting commentary on the cost of the failed border campaign. It's treason. Any other man would be dragged to the dungeons. The king slowly looks up from his plate, his eyes locking onto Thomas. The entire court holds its breath. But because it came from Thomas the Fool, the king has a choice. He can take it as an insult, or he can take it as a joke. He stares for a moment longer, then a slow smile spreads across his face, and he lets out a short, sharp laugh. "Perhaps, fool," the king says. "You should be my treasurer. You seem to be the only one who knows what's in the coffers." The tension in the room instantly shatters. The nobles start laughing, not just at the joke, but with sheer relief. Thomas, with one sentence, has managed to voice the entire court's anxieties, acknowledge the king's problem, and diffuse a potentially explosive situation, all while insulating himself with the label of fool. But you have to wonder, what if the king hadn't laughed? That tightrope he walked was 1,000 feet up, with no safety net. One wrong step, one misjudged mood, and his career and his life were over. Let's talk about a real man. A man named Will Somers. Somers was the court jester for one of the most terrifying and volatile monarchs in all of history, King Henry VIII of England. This is the king who broke with the Catholic Church, dissolved the monasteries, and famously executed 2 of his own wives. This was not a man you wanted to tell a bad joke to. Yet Will Somers not only survived in Henry's court, he thrived. He was one of the very few people who Henry genuinely trusted and loved. I couldn't believe it when I found these accounts. In Henry's later years, the king was in constant, agonizing pain from a jousting wound on his leg that became a festering ulcer. His temper, fearsome at the best of times, became legendary. Courtiers and even his own family would flee from his presence. But who did he call for? Will Somers. The jester would sit with the king, using his wit and gentle humor to soothe the tyrant's rage and distract him from his pain. He was more than an entertainer. He was the king's therapist. But his influence went far beyond that. There's a famous account of a poor man whose small patch of land, his only inheritance, was stolen by a wealthy, powerful nobleman. The man had no legal recourse. No court would dare rule against this powerful lord. In desperation, he went to Will Somers. The next day at court, Somers approached the king. He didn't make a formal petition. Instead, he presented King Henry with a riddle. He said, "Your Majesty, what is the answer when a great lord's new estate is so vast that it can swallow up a poor man's entire inheritance without the lord even noticing?" Henry, who was no fool himself, understood immediately. He was intrigued. He demanded to know the details. The story of the poor man's stolen land came out, not as an accusation, but as the answer to a fool's riddle. The king, his sense of justice piqued and his ego challenged, immediately ordered the nobleman to return the land. Will Somers succeeded where the entire legal system had failed. He used his unique position not just to speak truth to power, but to achieve justice for the powerless. This wasn't a clown. This was a political operator of the highest order, navigating the most dangerous court in Europe armed with nothing but his mind. Remember the powerful advisors I mentioned, men like Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell? Henry had them executed. Queens like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard? Executed. But Will Somers, the fool, was by Henry's side until the very end. He is even recorded as being with the king in his final moments. So, let's go back to that question. What was life actually like for a medieval jester? It wasn't about the juggling. It wasn't about the silly songs or the colorful costume. That was all a disguise. A theatrical mask that allowed them to play the most dangerous game in the kingdom. It was a life of constant pressure, of being the emotional and political barometer for the entire court. It was about having the intelligence of an advisor, the wit of a poet, and the courage of a knight, all while pretending to have the mind of a child. The greatest trick the court jester ever pulled wasn't making a king laugh at a joke. It was convincing the most powerful, paranoid, and dangerous people in the world that the sharpest man in the room was a complete and utter fool. And in doing so, he made himself utterly indispensable.